I want to transition now a little bit more to some kinds of tips for a lot of undergrad or people who are interested in breaking into consulting. And um, the first question is just based off of your own recruiting experience, what are some of the resources that you would use for case interviews? And are there any tips that you have for recruiting that most people don't know about and be really helpful from like an insider like you to provide some tips that most people don't know about?
So first part of the question was around what tools are particularly helpful. I really enjoyed, what is it, like Look Over My Shoulder? Is that what it's called? You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
I've heard of that one. Yeah.
Um, and that's basically a set of audio recordings where someone walks through what a good case sounds like, what a neutral, okay case sounds like, and what a bad case experience sounds like. And I think that's really helpful because the concept of a case interview is just very foreign when you've never done one before. You don't know what it's supposed to sound like. You don't really know what you're supposed to do. So I think that's like a really helpful place to start. Um, Definitely listen to the good ones as a kind of anchoring point. And what's great is also the person who created those casts also points out like what was good about them. So really helpful to listen to. Other than that, mostly just case books, which have previous cases that various companies have used in their interview cycles. Um, and just practicing casing like really diligently. I think it's a skill that you should do several cases before your first interview, before you're really at a place where it's not even that like you want to practice to the point where you're good at them. I think you have to practice to the point where you're comfortable with them because in an interview, it's like your nerves are so high. Um, so getting a lot, like racking up the numbers, is pretty helpful, at least for me. And then the second question was like, what are some key tips? There are two things that I always tell people when I run case interviews with them. The first is, in any way possible, try to engage your interviewer. So they will probably have done the same case with like 6 people throughout the day. Any way that you can like bring them into what you're talking about. So what I really like to do is I draw out like my framework or my structure for how I would respond to the hypothetical case problem. And I always turn it around and like use my pen to walk them through what I'm doing. And that's just one way to let them know that like I am trying to work with them on the problem.
Mm.
And then it doesn't feel as much of like it's a test for me. It's more of like a collaboration between us. And then the second thing, which also doesn't sound like a huge unlock, especially like if you're good at math. I'm not like the fastest at mental math. But I think also putting numbers in scientific notation so you don't drop zeros is really, really helpful when you're doing math. And then I feel like that can also just simplify the problem. Instead of doing like 4,000 divided by, I don't know, 2,500, you do like 4 divided by 2.5, and then you handle the 10 separately. And I think that's like a really nice and easy way to make sure you get the math right.
Got it. Thank you. Those are very specific. That's good. That's good to have specific advice. And on the topic of recruiting, how important is networking for consulting recruiting?
So that one is an interesting question. I think it depends on the firm because I think when you get to larger firms, they have very structured processes for how they pull resumes and things of that nature. Um, and I think there's some room for networking, but I think it's very difficult to build the required minimum baseline of repertoire to like get recommended or something along those lines through a networking event like at your university campus. But then I definitely recruited also for like some smaller firms, and they care a lot more because they are small about, I don't know if care more about, but like they have maybe more room for recommendations, or for the analysts might be the ones who are pulling the resumes or something along those lines. And when there's like less of a structured process for how you get chosen or like funneled into the recruitment process, I think networking can really help if you find someone that like you really click with.
It sounds like for networking, then in a general sense for consulting, it depends by the firm. But do you have any other tips in terms of when you're speaking with another like individual, or it's now that you've also been reached out to by so many students? You kind of gave one tip so far of kind of talking about things more conversationally, but are there any other kind of tips that come to mind?
Yeah, definitely. Trying to make a personal connection is great. And then what else would be helpful to know? People who have stood out to me. No, definitely that's it. Like people who have stood out to me at networking sessions have all been the ones who I've never heard a question that made me go like, wow, that's really interesting. Like I haven't heard of that before. Like as it relates to work, I think I've heard pretty much most standard questions. I think when people are genuinely interested in knowing more about me and my experience in a non-superficial way, that is very easy to tell, actually. So
Got it. And for those who are coming from undergraduate and non-target schools, do you have any suggestions for them on how they can break into consulting?
yeah, I think the definition of non-target will obviously be different by the consulting firms that you apply for. I think there are tons of really amazing consulting firms, maybe not like the biggest ones available to apply to, and they do very similar work. Um, so that's one thing. Um, the second thing, maybe this relates to your previous question a little bit better. I feel as though networking becomes a little bit more important. Um, Also related to what I said, when there's less of a structured process, because non-target schools, they don't have that structured process of like, this is when you apply, et cetera, et cetera. So I think reaching out and networking and dropping your resume will become a little bit more important there. And the third thing is there are a lot of associates that come in who don't come directly from undergraduate. They may have come from they'll have come from like their first or maybe second role out of school. So it's not something that you have to do right out of undergraduate. If you need to build your resume or your work experience, those are all things that are looked upon in a positive light when it comes to recruiting associates in not from undergraduate.